I tend to shout anyway. Is that better? Yeah, I think everybody can hear me. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Haupt. I work in SILT. I'm a researcher in SILT. And the research that I'll be presenting on was actually a much larger project. It was collaboration with 4 other institutions, and it was Carnegie funded. So just some background on the actual research that we conducted. Myself and Lorda Chernovich worked on this project. And so the actual title of the project was Blended Learning in Challenging Circumstances. And just to say something around challenging circumstances, in literature, challenging circumstances and using blended learning are often related to issues such as floods and other natural disasters where students couldn't get onto campus, and therefore there was a switch in the way that teaching and learning occurred. So as we know, there's an increase in blended learning globally. In 2016 and 2017, blended learning was already a part of the national landscape within South Africa, and it was incorporated, or it was used during the disruptions. So there's no other literature that exists around challenging circumstances related to disruptions and protests. Some of the background research at UCT, there was a study that Lorda was involved with, and that was perceptions and experiences of heads of departments, and that was related to the role of online learning specifically. Also, I was involved with another project before this one, and that was Student Personal Mobile Device Use Project, where a number of devices were incorporated, or not incorporated, but it was distributed to students who needed these devices. And specifically, it was the Extended Degrees program, and I worked with some of the other colleagues that are sitting here in front. So the research questions that we used or that we employed during this project, specifically the broader project, was things like, why do academics choose to use or not use blended learning? Which forms of blended learning did academics use? How did academics feel about using blended learning? Also, how did academics perceive the protests, and how did this then impact on the role of them actually employing or using blended learning in their teaching? What shaped academics' use of blended learning? Also, some of the tensions that arise from this. Who was involved in the use of blended learning? So the broader community. This could have been professional staff, such as our staff in SILT, and also what happened as a result of academics using blended learning. So the UCT context. So as we are aware that in 2016, there was a complete shutdown for about 2 weeks at UCT. And then based on this, there were some changes in the way that teaching was delivered across the board. So this included a shortening of the curriculum. Also, there was various deferments of examination. And then because of this, because of the shortening of the curriculum, a mini semester was employed at the beginning of 2017. As we were aware, in October specifically, I think it was the 14th, the VC then indicated that we should move to a blended learning approach, and this was sent out via email communication. And this was to ensure that there was a completion of the academic year. 2017, the VC then suggested that we plan 4 possible disruptions and then 4 possible shift again to blended learning for the end of the year again. And in 2017, there was further disruptions, and there was a shutdown about a day or 2, but also many students weren't able to get onto campus because of disruptions. And then the methodology we employed, so we used a mixed methods approach for data generation. The quantitative methods at least was a survey. The survey was conducted in August 2017, and it was around student access. Because the VC wanted to have an idea of if students were able to get onto the internet or able to access various VULA sites, we decided to do a student access survey. Of the survey, about 27% of students actually completed the survey. Also, we used VULA and lecture recording statistics, so LMS, the student analytics we used as well. Then with the qualitative data generation, I conducted 16 interviews with academic staff. Just to make a note here, at the time that I conducted these interviews, it was late in 2017, so it was quite difficult to get hold of staff because obviously there was the disruption, it was just before the exams, but also that we actually wanted to get to speak to staff during all of these things that were occurring. I also conducted 11 interviews with professional staff, and this included our SILT learning design team, as well as the technical support staff. With regard to students, I conducted 3 focus groups with students. It amounted to about 17 students. And then the data was then transcribed and coded using in vivo. We made use of the activity theory framework as well as ethics of care. Another note here is that I've just started looking at ethics of care, and it was something that had come up with my interviews with academic staff specifically. Also to say that the presentation will be focusing only on the interviews that are conducted with academic staff. So activity theory holds that the activities consist of processes both at the individual as well as the social level. These include mediating tools and artifacts, linking the processes together. An activity system, as a unit of analysis, allows for one to observe the actual processes by which activities shape and are shaped by their context. Systems are not always stable, as one can imagine, or harmonious, and may give rise to contradictions. So this was just a representation of our activity system. Some of the questions that I had indicated previously, I've actually put down, I don't know if you can see it, at each point of the pyramid. So for example, in this case, the subject would be the academic, specifically which academic used blended learning or did not use blended learning. I won't go through each of them, but you can have a look at that. And then in terms of the ethics of care framework. So according to Christie, discourses of education are premised on progress and development of what is good and what is bad, normal or deviant, and it often neglects inequalities and power relations which play out in these institutions. Christie also then says there's this need to develop an ethics of care in our educational institutions so that we value not only the intellectual development of students, but also that we value and nurture a concern for what it is to be a human being. Interestingly, I went to another presentation this morning. I think it was Edwina, I can't remember her surname, and she spoke about similar aspects, and this was related to students, which I found very interesting as well. So some of our preliminary findings. Based on the Vula statistics, we found that there was an increase in lecture recording. And this was, you can see there's a change in percentage between 2015 and 2016, and that was 38%. But then there's a big jump in the change in the percentage in 2017. Here, I'd just like to note that there was an increase in the number of lecture venues that were incorporated, that started using lecture recording facilities as well. And then moving on to the actual questions that we asked academics. And so I'll highlight a few quotes here from academics as well. So why did academics choose to use blended learning? A lot of them said it was to complete the academic year, or to complete as much as they could of their curriculum, to assist students with exam preparation. And then it was a directive from the university or faculty. Already engaging in blended learning approaches. That were some of the reasons why academics used it. And here are some quotes just related to the course, so completing their course. We managed to achieve all the course outcome that we needed to. And so it was done in the online space. Interestingly here, because it was 2017, just to note that academics then, because of 2016, they tried to finish their course a lot earlier, so that they wouldn't end up having to cram or cut out on their courses. So that was one of the main things that stood out. Again, why did academics choose to use blended learning? A lot of them felt that they needed to assist students. So even though it was an online space, they knew that they wouldn't be able to produce new material give students new material. So they try to incorporate a lot of the exam preparation through Vula and giving tips and telling students what to read, for example. So it says just of all of those factors, the anxiety and the stress from student side and the lack of face-to-face time. So they were very aware that them not actually seeing students before the actual exam, it would cause students a lot of stress and anxiety. And they actually said that students would be coming to them, so they'd find ways to come and speak to the lecturer. This was quite interesting. They felt that there was a gun against their head. So they needed to complete the year, because it came from the university and faculty management, they needed to supplant what they were doing. And a lot of them felt that this was a real problem because it wasn't the way that they were used to teaching. And because the university isn't a distance learning institution, that was a big problem as well. Then there were a lot of academics that were already engaging in somewhat of a blended learning approach, so it wasn't a big step for them. Someone else had indicated that they started in 2014 as well, and they've actually developed the techniques and how they were doing these things. Why did academics choose not to do blended learning? So, as I said, they completed their course timeously because they were aware that for the past 2 years there were disruptions, and they incorporated things earlier. They shifted a lot of their things. They just found ways to work around it. Then there were people that just said it didn't work because obviously in 2016 there was this shift to a blended learning way of doing things, and they just felt that it didn't work. They also felt conflicted. So they did not want to undermine the intentions of the protesters. This came out quite a bit amongst academics, where they felt that there was certain intentions by the protesters. They didn't want to be, it's like they were in conflict with that, and they didn't want to go against it. So this is just a few quotes. Academic had completed their course already, and disruption was the day after their last test. Again, why did they not want to use it? Blended learning didn't really work in our estimation, and there wasn't much of an appetite for it. So this one also, they felt conflicted, as I mentioned. People don't like what is happening with the students, or things that, but actually you have to find some way. Whatever way is least offensive to you, you have to find a way that works, what you need. Okay, so how did academics feel about it? So this was the affective aspect of it. They felt forced, as mentioned earlier. They also felt that it shouldn't be the first option to teaching. They believed that it was inappropriate for a residential university. And some of them were doing it already, as I said. So again, it was forced, it was business as usual. One of the academics was saying, you have now got to move audio teaching materials to an online space. So this obviously didn't sit well with them. But then again, there was the other tension that it was a necessary thing because they wanted to assist their students. I don't think it is ideal. I really don't know. So you can definitely start seeing some of the tensions that academics were feeling. Then how did academics perceive the protest, and how this then played a role in them using blended learning? Some were explicitly against the protest and resented having to use blended learning. Some of them were in favor of the protest and still resented having to use blended learning. Many felt that what was being promoted was not really blended learning. This again was very interesting. They felt that it was purely an online space. It went against the pedagogy of what blended learning was about. Also, a few of the academics said that the students that would actually benefit from blended learning were the privileged students, because in terms of access as well as cultural capital, so being able to access the various materials as well as just having the capacity to, the cultural capital to be able to access these things. So as I indicated, so it's not really blended learning. The context is different. So that ideal blended learning structure that I have just talked about relies on a certain capacity. The university's infrastructure, social infrastructure, access to resources, and things like the library, online resources, staffing, and support. So most of us are aware that gaining access to the library was an issue. And if you haven't been in the realm of blended learning, actually finding online resources, knowing how to go about gaining that resources was an issue as well. So, as I mentioned, few of the academics, the privileged students would be the ones that would actually benefit from this. So here an academic was saying, the thing about it is that all of these electronic things, which are great and they are marvelous, they benefit the wealthy students. They don't benefit the students who are struggling anyway. So again, you start seeing the picture of how it becomes a conflict for academics to engage with blended learning. So what shaped academics' use of blended learning? The role of the university, definitely. Senior decision makers, the lack of experience with using blended learning methodology, their discipline, so depending on the disciplinary requirements, affordances of blended learning, the nature of the pedagogy, of teaching and learning practices, and their peers and champions making use of blended learning. The role of the university. So I think this was again one of the academics. So I think people's frustration and confusion was just about the situation that academics are used to having a lot of control over their own teaching environment, and suddenly it was removed for all sorts of reasons. And they were told to do something different, which they didn't know how to do or what to do. So as I've been mentioning, so these various tensions that had arisen, they felt that they were asked to do something that wasn't really blended learning at all. There was ambivalence as to whether it was even around the value of what they were doing. The conditions were not enabling, specifically the practices and the context. The tensions between wanting to assist students to complete the academic year and not actually wanting to engage with blended learning. So this was quite a big tension. Wanting to support the protesters' cause, but also wanting to assist students who wanted to complete the academic year. So here again, just to highlight the ambivalence that academics felt. So I did not want to go online because I was unsure whether it could actually help students. I also had the perception, I don't understand how people are actually going to learn in this way. I remember this was one of the academics that was completely against this form of teaching. He was very much somebody that was used to a face-to-face approach, and he only understood that this is the way that students learn. The conditions were not enabling. I don't think I was very sensitive to the bigger picture. So I chatted to some other colleagues, and someone said he is not very comfortable teaching new material, knowing that there are some students who really are intimidated to come to class, and they don't have good Wi-Fi, and all the rest. So what are some of the things that happened as a result of using blended learning during the protest? The academic year was completed in some form, even if that meant that it was cut short, or at least that they were able to assist students with exam preparation. Also incorporating new methods into their practices. Blended learning developed negative associations as can be expected. So incorporating new methods into academics' practices. Here again, an academic had said, it does because it is a hot topic, and people who previously would have, I suppose, not got too involved because they just don't know where to start. So here this person is saying that they actually started using various methods. And what had happened, I think it was in 2016, they started looking at different methods. In 2017, they actually took it further, and they then got more support. They found the correct ways of doing things, I guess, and looked at different pedagogy around blended learning. The negative associations. This had happened both with academics as well as with students. So I have major doubts as to how effective the actual interventions have been in terms of helping students to learn in this time of crisis. And so I worry that this kind of online thing is a recipe for disaster in terms of actually being able to motivate students or to engage with material. And then coming to the ethics of care. So as I said, this was something that I had found talking to the academics and them expressing their care for students in whatever form that was. So care that students, because students were anxious, they wanted to assist students because they were anxious around completing the academic year. Some of them, the students were obviously anxious about funding requirements. So academics were very aware of this. I think the vast majority of academics were. So academics then engaging in what I had found was that academics were engaging in an ethics for education. So they had these model imperatives and finding ways to help students to feel less anxious, as I said, about completing the academic year as well as funding requirements. While being aware of the Fees Must Fall campaign and what it stands for and how this thing contradicts the above. So wanting to assist students, but on the other hand, also believing to some extent in what the campaign was about, the Fees Must Fall campaign. So there gives rise to a model dilemma then. Engaging with blended learning or not, the need to assist students, and by availing themselves and finding alternative ways of doing this. And then just to end off with, so the global trend in disrupting what universities are and who they are for. Again, this was something that had come up this morning in the keynote. So I tend to think that blended learning should be the beginning of the process rather than the response to an existing crisis. I think that there is a move globally that is destabilizing what universities actually are what they are and how it happens to, what is that? Yeah, sorry. Those are the symptoms for us in South Africa, such as fees, accommodation. I think this has often been overlooked, and this is obviously, as we can see, what has come up through the protests. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Genevieve. Any questions, folks?
Thank you very much for this great presentation. And I have a comment to make from my experience of undergraduate teaching, is that I think that ethics of education, ethics of care applied to education will become more and more important as the university will embrace inclusivity, innovations in teaching and learning. One of the concerns that I have as an academic is that we don't fully understand the student experience, and we have a very strict and narrow vision of what constitutes success. Is success only to be defined by pass and fail of a course, or it must include other elements? Do we prepare them, our students or our graduates, for resilience? Do we build in grit? Are we teaching them how to fail and how to get up if they fail? So these are some of the issues I think all universities should think about from time to time. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you have any stats from anywhere in the world about how blended learning affects student performance?
We haven't looked into any of that. Well, I haven't looked into it for this project. I think it's often difficult to try and pinpoint how blended learning affects student success rates, because I almost feel like there needs to be a pre and post, or there needs to be a group of students that weren't exposed to blended learning, and so it feels like it needs to be somewhat of a control group, and an experimental group. I think it's quite difficult to do that. I don't know if Laura can add to that.
There have been quite a number of studies that have looked at fully online as opposed to blended learning. And with fully online, students do worse on the whole, and particular groups of students tend to do worse. So weaker students or, And in the cases where they've been able to compare where there's a face-to-face version and an online version, the pass rates will be lower for the online version But that's not blended learning, that's fully online. But I can give you the studies if you'd be interested in them.
Hello. So I think something that stood out to me in this presentation was the theme that seemed to emerge really in terms of how academics feel about the notion or the concept of blended learning is fear and perhaps like resistance to change. So I was wondering what training does UCT offer, if any, to assist academic staff who would like to not just know how to use VULA, for example, but who would like to know more about the history of blended learning and blended learning methodologies?
As far as I'm concerned, there isn't an actual course. It's purely voluntary, and it's usually based on need in the sense of wanting to know how to use VULA for a specific reason, or how do you go about doing lecture recording. So I don't know, anybody could correct me.
Yes, I can help you out. So on the SILT website, so silt.uct.ac.za, there is a page for teaching resources. So that's one way. Another is through our fully online course, Facilitating Online, which I co-convene. And there's also a wonderful network, the Emerge Africa Network, which is for people across African higher education institutions. At the moment, we're running an online festival. But I think if you keep in touch with those three channels, you're sure to find something. There are also formal courses run by colleagues in SILT. Is that what you were going to mention? Okay, and there's at the SILT stand on level, what is it, the main level where the food court is, there's some brochures for that. You can check those out.
Just to add to that,
Yeah,
but
Jen?
it's still voluntary. It's still on a very voluntary basis. It's not
There's a
something
scale
that's
of
incorporated.
No, it's still voluntary, but I think there's a scale of offerings that are formal and others that are more informal.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I'd be interested in the student perspective. I know you concentrated on the academics, but maybe briefly if you could elaborate, because just from the students' feedback to me is that a lot of them were sent home, and they just, even though CELSI and Vodacom and that allowed them to have free access, they had no access. And we felt it was very unfair for some students to have access and other students not. So perhaps maybe the student perspective is a helpful one. Thank you.
So the student perspective, students hate blended learning. They hate the word blended learning. I found that a lot of students didn't actually understand what it was. To them, it was purely online, on my own. I had no access to my lecturer. They just gave me things and I needed to study it on my own. That is the only perception I got. 1 or 2 students said they prefer learning that way, but the majority of students completely hated it. What else is there? I think that was the gist of what I got from students. Just not having they're used to having a face-to-face interaction, because what they actually said was they were able to ask a question and get the response immediately. Even with exam preparation, they felt that one of the students actually said, if I ask a specific question, I'd get the response, and when I get that question in the exam, I'll remember the answer because there was an interaction. So if that answers your question, it's just like an overview. Okay.
Any more questions? I'm going to ask our next presenter to set up so long. And for folks who want to move, now's your chance.